right, welcome everybody to our virtual education program. My name is Kara Murgatroyd. I am the Education and Support Services Coordinator for the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia in Central Zone. During the COVID crisis, we aren't presently offering face-to-face services or programming. Instead, however, we're using the Zoom platform to stay connected with you. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the session. It's a private and confidential chat box addressed to the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia host. If you don't see it, use your mouse to hover near the bottom and there should be a chat in the middle of it. You can click on that and it should pop up for you. We hope it pops up for you. We know it will pop up for you. Remember to press enter to send the message to us. Questions will only be seen by the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. For the best viewing, we suggest using the speaker view. So you can see that in the top right-hand corner of your screen. If you see speaker view, just click on it, and it should make whomever is speaking the largest picture on the screen. So our audience today includes people living with dementia, people caring for somebody with dementia, and then of course those individuals who would like to know more about grief and about living with dementia and the different aspects of grief that can occur. A reminder that this session is being recorded. Your microphones and cameras are turned off, so your faces and voices will not be part of this recording. We'll have about a 20 to 30 minute presentation followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers. And so today it is my pleasure to be able to actually introduce to you Roy Ellis. He's a therapist and grief counselor, and Roy brings 30 years of experience working with bereavement, trauma, sudden loss, and frontline support for private, government, and community organizations which have experienced an unexpected death, tragedy, or workplace disaster. Roy is the bereavement coordinator of Nova Scotia Health Palliative Care Central Region. Today, Roy will be speaking about grief, broken hearts, and jumpstart. So thank you so much, Roy, for coming in today, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Kara. Thank you also to Claire, and for all of you for being present on this. So it's rainy. It's a little rainy here today where I am. Not sure how it is where you are. And I'm just delighted to have had this opportunity to talk a little bit about grief. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to grief today. I'm not going to talk about my usual sort of grief 101, like what grief looks like and what happens to us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to talk more today with you, with your permission, about the way in which grief can actually be sort of a way for us to move into our lives and to move into our fearfulness of being, to encounter anxiety, to encounter the parts of ourselves that are at times frozen and at times have poor coping, where we're anxious, and it's the parts of ourselves that can get lost in life. The grief can be used in our grief, which is with us every day. I mean, we're sort of every single day in a chorus of grief. We're in a river of it every single day. Every moment we wake up, every moment behind us is a lost moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how grief can actually be used as a way of awakening as people. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking about grief, and perhaps a little bit different topic than you might have been expecting. But I hope you'll hang in with me and allow me to present this material to you. I also want to warn you that I'm expecting possibly a load of wood to come in here today. And as a result of that, in the middle somewhere, it could happen that I have to step away for 5 minutes to direct the wood, which is going to be coming right in here, and then there's going to be a lot of noise. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and I hear that Kara has a really great joke during that period of time. Actually, a real screamer. She's prepared that for weeks now, actually, to deliver it. So I'm pretty sure that'll be very exciting when the time comes. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to share a screen now, if all works well, and I'm going to move into our talk. Hopefully, you can see a little bit of me and a little bit of the screen. Is that all working? Is this working, folks? Could I just have a thumbs up from somebody, or can Kara or Claire tell me that this is working? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So our topic today is broken hearts and jump starts, and I'm happy to be here today to present this for the Alzheimer's Society in their educational series. Let's see if I can navigate this. I have to figure out now how to move it forward. There we go. So today we're just very briefly, we're going to just start by talking briefly what is grief. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about aloneness. And we're going to talk about attachment theory. We're going to talk a little bit about feelings, about the body, and then sort of sum up all the things we've talked about as a form of waking up as people and waking up our spirits or waking up in ourselves. And then we're going to answer some questions. So it's a lot to cover. I'm going to move quickly, but I hope this is really interesting for you. And I hope you hear something today that you haven't heard before. That's my hope. So we are a society that doesn't value despair or darkness or sadness or fear or anger. In fact, all the messages that we get from everyone and from everywhere is that these are sort of unhelpful, that our feeling states are unhelpful. That if you were sad too long, that would be a waste of time, or that there might be something wrong, that you might need a drug. Or if you're angry, it could be toxic anger. Or if you're assertive. Or if you're afraid that you might just have anxiety and might need to be medicated. We don't know really in our culture, we really don't know how to deal with powerful and challenging and disturbing feelings. And of course, grief is one of the most powerful human experiences, where usually the big three, sadness, anger, and fear, are all intermeshed and scrambled up into very complicated, very complex, to say nothing of bitterness and loneliness and emptiness, and confusion and betrayal and all the other things that can happen when we're grieving. So we're not in a society that really makes a lot of room for the challenges of strong feeling. And most of these people today do not even differentiate between sorrow and depression. In fact, they're very, very different things, sadness and depression. Depression is a numbing, it's a global numbing of feelings. In fact, it's a kind of a frozenness, it's a kind of almost a lack of feeling. You might consider it as like almost getting anesthetized in our fear and our anger and our sadness. It gets anesthetized, and there's a sense of flat coldness and a heaviness that holds down our feelings. But you can't really say that sadness is depression. So we confuse those things. And we very often now use the language of depression to talk about sadness, which is very unfortunate. It's all about death, however, in the final analysis, in our encounter with death and the fragility of our mortal lives. And as La Rochefoucauld said, death and the sun are not to be looked at steadily. It is difficult for us, for our hearts, for the human being, to look at death because we experience grief almost instantly and fear. And so when we talk about grief, we're also talking about death. It's always in the backdrop, and our vulnerability and our fragility and our mortality. And those are big topics. Those are not small things, and they can make us as human beings withdraw a little bit into a fearful place to sort of protect ourselves and to feel safer in the world. And so there's some things that we do to feel safer in the world, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those things in the positive and some of those things which are negative. Good old Billy Shakespeare said that every man can master a grief, and I think these days we would say every person can master a grief, but they that have one. In other words, grief is one of those things that from the outside, when you're on the outside, you're like, yeah, well, grief, get over it in 3 weeks, get back to work. But on the inside of grief, for those of you who are grieving or who have experienced grief in your life, and there are many different losses that you can have, and divorce, job loss, loss of your security and your sense of self for very different reasons, different kinds of traumas. We know that when you're in grief, it's no joke, and it is not an easy thing to move through. So mastering grief is not what we're here to do and not what I'm here to teach, but we are here to understand how grief can actually serve us. So as we jump into a little bit of an understanding of grief, I'm going to start with this beautiful quote from Judith Viorst, who said, "We live by losing and leaving and letting go." That's how we live. We don't lose by gaining and coming towards and grabbing. It's actually the whole process of living says that sooner or later, with more or less pain, we must all come to know that loss is indeed a lifelong human condition, if not the human condition. So loss is something that we are in all the time, but we spend a lot of time trying to ignore it or trying to work around it or trying to stay away from it. But in fact, what would happen if we relaxed and recognized that loss is sort of, it's kind of the water that we swim in, right? It's kind of our habitat. Okay, let's just get a couple definitions down. Excuse me, a few definitions down that might be helpful to us so we know what we're talking about. Number one, grief is a term used to describe the distress, relational pain, or suffering related to loss. So that could be divorce, that could be job loss, that could be a trauma, it could be losing your wallet. Okay, so grief, you could be like, grief is that experience of just the distress and discomfort we feel when there's a loss. Now, bereavement is the period after a death of a person during which grief, those loss experiences, those distresses are experienced, and mourning occurs. And mourning are the specific rituals and processes by which people adapt to a loss, including funerals, rituals, expressions, crying, cultural practices. So mourning is what we do, the things we do with our body and the things we do with each other. Bringing someone lasagna is a mourning ritual. Going to a funeral is a mourning ritual. Putting a body into a grave or burning it and having it cremated. All these things are part of mourning and part of that help us to sort of rework our world so that we can understand that it no longer includes the deceased. And of course, for people with Alzheimer's, and for those of you who are taking care of someone who has Alzheimer's, we also know that this grief and the bereavement and the mourning is happening while the person often is still alive, which makes it very complicated. Complications of grief are common. It's about 10 to 20%. I would say somewhere around 15% of people have a complicated grief where they're not dealing as well, they're not comfortable with signs and reminders of the death, memories of the deceased person, having trouble accepting the death, having trouble feeling their feelings, being avoidant of reminders, being avoidant of going to places and seeing people, and this going on for 6 months or a year or 2 years. So that's complicated grief. And I had an opportunity to actually take Catherine Shear's complicated grief program, and I really appreciated getting to know her work a little bit more. Interestingly enough, it's more common to have that kind of complicated. I hear the truck. I need 5 minutes right now. Kara, you're on. I'm really sorry, guys, but I'm going to have to pause for a minute. Just hang on. My apologies.
Okay, I think you all can probably hear me in the background. So just thinking, Roy has his screen shared, but I don't think you can see me just yet, which is probably okay. It's interesting that Roy actually distinguishes between, grief and bereavement and mourning. And I think one of the things that Roy will talk about actually is the fact that for people caring for a person with dementia, we look at the idea of ambiguous loss. And for those of you caring for somebody, whether it's a partner, whether it's a parent or a family, another family member, it's interesting because, your family member, although they are physically present, at times, sometimes they may not remember different significant events in their life. So they may not remember anniversaries and birthdays and those sorts of things. So that can actually be quite difficult for people. And for those of you actually, if you have questions about that, this might be actually a good opportunity too, to add those questions in the chat. As Claire had mentioned earlier, the questions go directly to us. So not everybody will see those questions. So perhaps
Hi,
it's
Cara.
Oh, hi, Claire.
Hi. Yeah, we do have some questions coming in through the chat.
Perfect.
So,
Excellent.
yeah.
So something to think about for those of you who are caring for a family member with dementia. What are some of the losses that you've noticed? Is it the loss in, the change in a relationship, or is it the loss in a person's abilities? And for those of you who are living with dementia and are watching our education session today, if you feel, if you feel comfortable, please feel free to add those into the chat. What are some of the first things that you noticed? And it's a grieving process, I think, that we have. It's not just the loss of a family or a friend or a relationship, it's abilities, and it's the things that we used to do. And I think during COVID, especially, we're all sort of grieving. We're grieving the change in our routine. We're grieving the change also, probably, I'm thinking, in the resources that we would have used, prior to COVID. So maybe it was a support group that some of you may have been attending. And then for those of you who are, involved with some of our programs at the Alzheimer's Society, perhaps it could be, a coffee and conversation that you were meeting face to face, or even being able to pop in and see people in another province. Like a lot of us have been doing staycations. So there's a lot of change when we think about grief as well. So it definitely takes some getting used to. And I'm thinking probably about now, I'm thinking he might be stacking his cords of wood. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just jump out for a minute, give you guys some time to think about other changes and how we've experienced grief in our journey so far with dementia, but also how we've experienced grief during COVID. The loss of connection that we've had with friends. It's getting a little bit easier now because the restrictions have been reduced a little bit, but I'm gonna pop out for a second now, and I'll let you start to think a little bit about some of the other ways that grief has impacted you. And we'll look forward to Roy popping back in again and sharing some more of his wisdom and experience with us.
Thanks, Cara. And yeah, participants, people watching right now, just keep typing those questions in the chat, and we do have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So Roy will be answering your questions. So thanks so much for your patience.
I'm back.
Oh, here he is. Welcome back, Roy.
How was that? How was the joke?
It was great.
It was lovely.
I really missed out.
It went over really well, didn't it, guys? Big wink, wink.
Yes, that's right.
My apologies for that. I really do appreciate your understanding. And shall I jump right back in?
Most definitely.
All right, here we go. I think I was pointing out that complicated grief is more prevalent about women older than 60, which I think is an interesting little fact. All right. And of course, for folks who are taking care of somebody with Alzheimer's or have Alzheimer's themselves, they understand that there is a lot of ambiguous loss, ambivalent loss in related specifically to the experience of dementia and to loving and losing somebody who has Alzheimer's disease. And some of the things that complicate the grief of ambiguous loss is the diffusion and the slipperiness and the kind of difficulty of defining it, identifying what is exactly that we're losing, when we're losing it. When it comes and it goes, we lose it for a while, but then we get it back. So there's a slipperiness to it. And it can be disenfranchised. In other words, people don't understand the disease progression and don't really understand our grief, and so they don't really respond to us as grievers. They just think, well, the person's alive, so we're fine. And then we'll grieve when the person is dead. But we all know that that's not exactly how it works. And I'm sure most of you know this. Ambiguous loss is generated by slow, confusing decay of relationship, marriage, and the connections. In other words, even if there's a spouse and the other spouse has Alzheimer's, the marriage they're married, but what's the marriage consist of now, other than a contract? It's just sort of not necessarily as easy to define. And of course, the demands that are made, the ethical, moral, spiritual, familial decisions one has to make with no a guidebook or social contract. So it's very difficult. Ambiguous grief, ambiguous loss is very difficult to deal with. And any of you all know about this. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time talking about it. I did want to talk to you about this model, which I think is really helpful to understand about life. And that we move in during grief between two orientations. So this is a model developed by Strobe and Schutt. Once as we're in this sort of loss orientation where we're doing our grief work, grief is really present. We're feeling hopeless and sad and broken, and we don't see a future. There's a brokenness of the bonds and the ties, and a sense of avoidance of life, and avoidance of the future, and avoidance of anything that might look hopeful and connective. And instead, we're in a deep place of sadness and isolation, and oftentimes despair. But we can bounce almost instantly. You see these zigzaggy lines going back and forth between these two, that we actually bounce back and forth very quickly during grief between that loss orientation and a restoration orientation, where we're attending to life's new changes, we're doing new things, being distracted and avoidant of our grief, in denial of our grief in a very healthy way, and experiencing new roles, new relationships, and new identities that make us feel alive and future-oriented. We're very present in a life without the deceased, as opposed to very present in a life where the deceased is absent, and we're very aware of the absence. I think that's a very important thing to understand, that it's very normal and natural for us to bounce back and forth between a loss orientation and a restoration orientation, and that it's not like a gradual sort of upward. I mean, there is a sense that it's gradual upwards, but it's actually more like this, or starting low and kind of slowly getting high. But I really think it's important to understand that our losses are just important as our restorations. And so that sort of strength and weakness and strength and weaknesses is part of how we heal through grief. Okay. Now I want to shift gears and talk about one of the greatest challenges of grief to me, and certainly in the people that I work with, which is the avoidance, the denial, and the suppression of feelings and of experience as a result of grief. The overwhelm that we experience as a result of the painful feelings of the breaking of the attachment with the other, the permanent breaking of the physical bond between the other. R.D. Laing, a psychiatrist and a hero to many people, really fought for the rights of people with mental illness. And here he is looking funky with his bare feet. Said that there is a great deal of pain in life, and perhaps that the only pain that can be avoided is the pain that comes from trying to avoid pain. I love that quote. As we learned earlier from Judith Viorst, life is full of loss. Life is full of a river of losses every day. We have joys, we have celebration moments, but we know that life moves more and more toward things leaving us. We get older, our bodies change, our values change, and ultimately we lose our bodies. We lose every single friend that we have. We will lose everything eventually. That's painful for us. We very often, not the question, but the reality is we very often add pain on top of that pain by trying to avoid and push away pain itself. So this is what I want to address today, very shortly and very kind of briefly. What pushing away pain does, and what grief tends to do, is to alienate us and make us feel alone. That feeling of being alone and alienated is shared by all of us. All the great artists, everyone in the world, everyone I've ever met, everyone I've ever talked to as a therapist, talks about being incredibly alone. But there is a very particular kind of aloneness that comes when we're suffering, that comes when we feel that we're having an experience and a pain deep within that is very difficult for us to show to other people because we don't quite know if we're prepared to be seen that vulnerable or that painful or that broken. We don't even know if we're willing to see ourselves as that broken and vulnerable. And we get a little panicky and we sort of begin to sort of collapse in and put a shell around us, as we all know, like when we get hurt, you know, even your body does that, you know, if your body gets hurt, we sort of protect in, right? So there's a way in which suffering and pain can make us pull in and get very protective, but also there's a way in which the aloneness of that can be part of the greatest suffering that goes on. The isolation, the loneliness, and the inability to connect with others can be the most, or to be seen, be truly seen by others in our pain, or to even know how to show our pain and be seen. Hope this is making sense. Isolation, we are wired for attachment in a world of impermanence. Where things die, where things break, we are wired for attachment. In fact, attach and connect with those we love, to be seen and to see, to give and to have stuff given to receive and to be received by others. This is deep and hardwired into our one of my great heroes. And a lovely guy, and he really is as happy as he looks. Well, at least most of the time. He has quite a very difficult story of life. But so in this brokenness that we have, and in this loneliness that we have, interestingly enough, to get attached. But attachment itself is the problem when we lose somebody, or when we're losing somebody, or when the attachment is breaking a little at a time, as it does with Alzheimer's. We're both wired for attachment, and we're troubled by attachment. Whoops, go the other way. I don't know where his picture went. There was supposed to be a picture of the guy, but it's not there. So John Bowlby is the guy who really did the most work on attachment theory. And he said that that number one, during when a child misses its mother, first it feels numb, or when we lose somebody, when someone dies, we feel numb. This lasts for a few hours to a week. Can be interrupted with periods of intense distress or anger. In the second phase, we're yearning, there's searching behaviors. This can go on for months or years. Phase 3, there's a sort of disorganization and despair as we realize we can't find the person, we can't find them in our world. In phase 4, he says there's a greater or lesser degree of reorganization. So this is his understanding of grief based on what he saw with babies and mothers and how things work. The reality of grief is that it's an attachment issue. It's attachment, separation, distress. It's a really important thing to understand that when we lose somebody, we're literally, it's like a mother and child. When mother, it immediately starts to panic, starts to make noises, starts to call out, starts to search. And if it can't find its mother, it will freak out. And then eventually, if it still can't find its mother, it will move into a period of despair. It'll just be inconsolable. So this is what we're dealing with when we're talking about grief. We're actually talking about an attachment breakage of the highest order, because we can't find the person who is gone. They're not coming back. Now, the good news about that is that like George said, an absolutely exciting afternoon here at Roy's house. The continuing bonds theory says that even though we've lost that person, even though that person is gone, we actually continue to stay related to them. We don't actually, we don't actually ever have to leave the person. We don't have to let go of the person, but we actually renegotiate the relationship with the deceased. So we actually continue to hold and continue to stay attached, but only with the person's relationship of love internally, not in the external world. So it's not about letting go, but about holding on to what works and to what remains. We also are more aware that grief is in the body. And in fact, when we're grieving, grief is experienced just like anxiety or sadness or happiness, as a bodily experience. And we don't really give as much attention when we're grieving these days to the experience of grief in the body. The discomfort in the body is part of why we hide. We don't just hide because, oh, I lost somebody, I'm so sad, but that sadness is felt bodily in our muscular system, in our nervous system, in our endocrine system, in our circulation system. We know that there's discomfort and actual physical pain and discomforts and sensations that make us very uncomfortable. This is something that we don't talk about much when it comes to grief, is that many of the reasons why people go internally and hide and sort of become isolated and become broken and become sort of unable to function and unable to be happy for long, long periods of time, caught up in complicated grief cycles, is because of the uncomfortable sensations in their body. The neurophysicist Antonio Damasio talked a lot about the body and a lot about the body as a place of feelings. It's interesting that we move from the body to feelings very quickly, because feelings are pretty much, our cognitions are about what we think and how we process the world of our experience. But feelings are primarily, as he says, about the quality of the state of life inside our body, and what he calls the body's old interior, which means our ancient bodily processes, which have nothing to do with how this works. In other words, any time we have a feeling, in other words, I feel sad, or I feel bitter, or there's bodily sensations literally happening in the viscera, in the muscles, in our face, in our nervous system. And that's actually where most of the information comes to about our feelings and about our emotional world. And the valence describes our mental perception, whether those are positive, negative, or neutral. But feelings don't need necessarily us to think about them to be felt. We can just feel them instantaneously, discomfort, comfort, or neutral feelings. But then we'll do some thinking about them. And our feelings are a moment-to-moment report on the state of life in the interior of us as an organism. And that organism can feel very, very uncomfortable at times. And we don't always recognize how deeply powerful the interior experience. We can experience that with depression as a kind of a numbness and a kind of heaviness, or anxiety as a kind of a threat system, and the discomfort or the pounding of the heart, or the heaviness and the emptiness, or the lack of energy. So our emotions are really, really important, but our emotions are very often, we actually push away at emotions. We oftentimes think they're bad, especially when they're painful. But in fact, as Damasio says, our organism is hardwired to flourish and to be better than fine. In other words, pain and discomfort and disturbances within our body are actually messages about the real way that we actually are, which is, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, I'm hurting. And those aren't dangerous feelings, they're just uncomfortable ones, but they do tell us that our body is in distress, and it's in distress because an attachment is broken. That feeling of distress, and encountering that feeling of distress, those true feelings of sadness or anger or fear, by being close to those, actually, by staying close to those, by not pushing away, but by staying close to those, really wonderful things can happen toward being better than fine. Khalil Gibran says that many of us spend our whole lives running from feeling with the mistaken belief that you cannot bear the pain, but you have already borne the pain. You've already borne the pain. What you have not done is feel all you are beyond the pain. So we pull ourselves back in grief very often, pull ourselves back into a safe place, afraid of the pain, afraid of what's going to happen if we feel the pain. But Gibran is saying, hey man, it's already in you. You're just not allowing yourself to feel it. You're now allowing yourself to sort of acknowledge it. And when we do acknowledge it, he says that what appears is this whole picture of life beyond our pain. In other words, it's almost like we have to feel our pain to move through and to move to a beyond, and all that we are and all that we can be beyond our pain. Pretty interesting thought. Diana Fascia, someone else who I've studied with, reminds us that we are not just a bundle of pathology, of problems and issues and pains that lodge deeply in our brains and our bodies, our brain and our body. There for awakening lie the innate wired-in dispositions for self-healing and self-righting. In other words, behind all that pain is this desire for our body to actually balance off. We are shaped by a deep desire to be known, which is about attachment, to be seen, which is about attachment, and recognized as we strive to come into contact with the parts of ourselves that are frozen. So now we're starting to just sort of, I'm almost done here. Yeah, I start to have a bit of a picture that our pain is not all that we are, but it's sort of through our pain, there is this hardwired need through pain and through our feelings. That's actually how we sort of grow and move more toward being seen, coming into contact with others, and coming in contact with the parts of ourselves that are frozen or broken or withdrawn. So there's this really interesting mystery happening between, as we feel our feelings, as we truly be with them, we do feel discomfort, we feel the distress, but we also are moved toward being with people, we're moved toward contact, we're moved toward sharing, and in that moment something mysterious can happen that actually brings us into a state of well-being. Rumi said you have to keep breaking your heart until it opens, that in fact our job as human beings is to break so that we can open. Open to love, open to life, open to who we truly are, to be fearless. And I should say courageous. We're going to have fears, but to be courage, to have heart courage, is to keep allowing your heart to break until it opens. So my final slide here today is, if we awaken in this time, we awaken with a sob. To awaken is to experience grief. If we really allow grief to really live in us as a feeling in our body, we may awaken with a sob to our own life. Thank you. That is my talk for today. And I'm just going to, this is how you can get a hold of me, Roy Ellis at Facebook, at Roy Ellis Grief, or my website, royfellis.com. Sorry about all these little crazy things that happened today, but I really appreciate your attention. And I hope that my talk wasn't too confusing. I appreciate it.
That was excellent, Roy. You kept us on our toes today, for sure.
I did. It's my job.
You know, we have a couple of questions that I wanted to get through, but it was so interesting when you spoke about the quote that you shared, Roy, by Judith Viorst. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly.
That's right. That sounds right.
We live by losing and leaving and letting go. And I don't think we realize that grief really and loss, it's a lifelong condition, like she said. And I think that's something, you know, for those of us that don't feel comfortable with grief, I think we are afraid of it, you know, and it's something that's part of the human condition.
It is.
Right. And I think I remember hearing you speaking in another presentation about grief, and you talked about, you know, it's human, and tears are a release. You know, and I don't think necessarily we think of tears as good things, but I think, as you said, it's that way of releasing and then moving forward, which is really key and really important for our well-being, right?
Couldn't have said it better, Kara.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into first question that we have here. Are you ready, Roy?
Hit me.
You ready? Okay. Okay, so this individual says, can you speak to the concept of deep ambiguous loss associated with the slow process of caregiving for a family member with Alzheimer's disease? Any tools, I guess, is what they're looking for the marathon of grief period.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Great question. And probably, you know, again, some of what I talked about, I'd like to, even though I think it was a bit obscure, and I'm working at trying to make it a little less obscure, but what I'm talking about is about staying present and authentic to our feelings. We have a great tendency to want to go into caregiver mode, and we're in work mode, and we're in nurse mode, and we're actually not attending to how we feel about these losses. We're not attending to the sadnesses that arise when we just lost a little piece of our mother or our father or our brother or our spouse, and we stay in front of, it's like the tidal bore, and we're just staying in front of the tidal bore. We're just not, we don't want to get caught up in the frothing of feelings and that confusing mixed mess of anger and sadness and fear. And so one of the things I really think that we have to do in all of life, not just, you know, with ambiguous loss, because, you know, there's lots of ambiguous losses. Like getting old is an ambiguous loss. Getting old is our primary ambiguous loss. It's slow, it's degenerative, it's inevitable, it's not going away, there's no escaping it. You get uglier, right? Getting parts of you falling off, parts you aren't working, you're losing your memory. I mean, if you think about it, like, ambiguous loss is the primary reality of being human, of not being able to put our finger on everything. I wrote a page the other day, and I'm writing a book, and I wrote a page about the incompleteness of feelings, that the idea that sometimes the sky is dark, but it doesn't rain. That there's this sense that there can be a brooding, an almostness of our feeling states, an almostness, a sense of pregnancy, but the thing not coming yet. And I think with much of life, as with all caregiving, there's a sense that we're sort of halfway in an unformed place. So we have to really stay conscious and aware of that, as opposed to sort of, like, I'll wait until it actually happens, to move into that mixed feelingness, to move into and to really penetrate that, and to take time, intentional time, obviously, away. I mean, I'm always encouraging caregivers to, like, take time away, to actually just turn in, to be intentionally, to turn toward their feelings, toward self, toward their body. The body is always the place of encounter. If you want to really learn how you are, just ask your body how it is, and it will tell you. So that would be my answer, is sort of a willingness to stay present to the discomforts and to the processes of those discomforts. And I would also add that to add in, as much as you can, some playfulness. It's almost the thing that always goes by the wayside is playfulness, is like getting out, going out, recognizing that your whole life isn't about loss, your whole life isn't about caregiving, your whole life isn't about those ambiguous things. Like, play isn't ambiguous at all. It's a great healing structure for us when we're caught and we're trapped. So going kayaking or walking or going away for a little weekend or something. But we have to re-nourish ourselves as much as possible. Thank you for that. I hope I answered it a little bit.
That's a really great point. Like you said, where is it in your body, and how are you feeling? And I think that's really key. You know, we're grieving, but at the same time, we need to get some sort of balance. It's sort of that teeter-totter, right? You're feeling down one day, and you had spoke earlier there of the the dual process of coping with bereavement. And so you're constantly being pulled or bounced back between the loss orientation, the denial, the avoidance, and then you're at that restoration piece as well, where you are meeting new people and you're taking over these new relationships and these new roles. So there's that growth that's happening as well, which is really key. And so through grief, we also grow. And you talk about that river, which I think is beautiful. So yeah, it's really important, as you say, too, to get back to that sort of inner child that we all sort of push away and we don't play, you know, and what better way to get out in nature, go kayaking, and just to kind of get yourself out of that frame of mind of grief and loss. And it's sort of a rejuvenation as well, I think, which is really important. Absolutely. I mean, I think all of us know that every time we get out in nature or do something fun, or read a book, or just take time for ourselves to turn towards self and to love self, to be compassionate towards self, that we're actually more equipped to come back into the caregiving moment. And I think it also broadens our perspective. And one of the things I'm always encouraging people who are involved in dementia is to keep renegotiating the relationship. Like, we have this idea of a fixed relationship. Like, you're my father, I'm your son, and you're always going to be father. And so as you enter dementia and I see you changing, like, you're not quite the man I used to be, I'm resentful and I'm angry because I don't have the man I used to have. Well, that's fair enough. There's room for that. But on the other side, there's a new relationship. There's literally a new relationship to be built with someone who's different. And what would it mean to actually expand large enough to both be angry and sad because I don't have the old, and to be really curious and excited about the encounter with the new. And on both sides, we have to be different. I'm a different person here than I am here. And so it broadens our sense of self, opening us to a wider sense of reality. And actually, this can be really interesting and curious and maybe even humorous, some of the crazy stuff happening over here. But if we're only looking for this, if this is all we want, if we want to hang on to this concrete sense of what a person should be, we're going to suffer. We're going to suffer really hard. So there's a place for that sadness and that grief, but there's also a place for this curious exploration of, well, what is this new relationship with this interesting person who's nothing like he used to be, or comes and goes,
bounces back and forth. How can I stay flexible and move and just relax in that, grieving here, but also enjoying seeing this person when they're back. Oh, good to have you back. But also like, hey, who are you? What's that all about? What? You know, I don't know.
It's that curiosity that you said, you know, like of this person who is in front of me now. And it's actually being in the here and the now. And that's often what we say to family members is you really have to sort of jump into the present and be in the moment with your family member, because in that moment, that's what you have. They may not remember the past. So to kind of delve in where that person is, I think that's really key too. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, presence, right. I mean, we can go into that, could be a whole other talk, but the idea of, you know, what it means to be present to each other. Yeah.
Yeah. I have another question here. Can you speak about dysfunctional grief? Everybody grieves differently, but if somebody is stuck in their grief, what would you suggest?
Well, I wouldn't call it dysfunctional first. I'd call it complicated or complex.
Complicated?
Yeah, complicated or complex or traumatic. Dysfunctional just sounds a little bit more clinical in a way. I mean, the reality is that many of us have complicated grief. Many of us get stuck. We don't just get stuck in grief. We get stuck in addictions. We get stuck in our relationships. We get stuck in bad patterns of parenting. We get stuck in bad patterns at work. So, hey, let's just admit that we're creatures that love our habits. We're creatures that love to walk in the same rut. So that's not just true about everything but grief. And when it's grief, all of a sudden doesn't mean all of a sudden we're pathological monsters. You're right, like you're stuck and it's dysfunctional. It's like, welcome to humanity, you're stuck in something. You're mired down in something. So there are a couple of things that we can do. It's a bit more complicated. Certainly the therapy that I do with people when grief is complicated is more tricky and is a bit more exact and demands a little bit more attention to certain things, but certainly recognizing, the first thing we have to recognize in stuck patterns is that we need support, that we need to try not to do it alone. So undoing the aloneness of a stuck pattern, whether it's an addiction of any sort, or whether we're mired down in our own emotional world or mired down in some, you know, fear. Like here, an example would be like, I can't walk back in. I'm working with somebody right now who can't go into a restaurant in her hometown, or a small hometown in Nova Scotia, because that was the last place that her loved one went before they died. Now, there's only one restaurant in this little town, and so she has this inability to go into that restaurant. So that's actually, she's stuck there. So that means her world is like collapsed in to this sort of smaller, safe place where she doesn't have any reminders or cues of any of the things that remind her that the person is gone. So that I would say would be a complicated grief. Now, at the beginning of grief, that could be very normal. That would be a very normal thing to happen for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 months. But if this continues on, then what I'm going to want to do is start to work with a person like that to slowly relax and soften, and first to face those fears, to begin to move toward those fears. Like, what happens to your body when you look, or you start by just thinking about that restaurant? Uncomfortable feelings, I get anxious, I'm moving up here. So there's fear, there's sadness. So we begin to sort of actually work with the feelings that are becoming triggered, because it's feelings that they're avoiding, not the place. It's the feelings that happen when they get to the place. So almost all complicated grief is stuck feelings, or feelings that we're afraid of. So moving toward our feelings, again, it's always about moving toward our feelings, toward our body, and toward recognizing that these are legitimate and good insofar as they're good to have feelings, and that they will not destroy us, they won't annihilate us, we won't perish, we won't fall apart into mania or into mental illness, but we may really experience pain, really experience sadness. So, you know, I suggest that people, get the support that they need to draw other people around them, to get support, to undo your aloneness, to undo your isolation. Gather your little crew of people that can love you and care for you and be on your side. Get yourself a good therapist if you're super stuck as well. And then you're going to want to gently lean in toward those uncomfortable places, so that you can move into those places, move into the world, and that you're not in a cage of your own grief anymore. It's okay to be in a cage for a little while, but that's my answer. I seem to be viewing a screen.
Yeah, sorry, somebody had just asked to show our screen there too for people who would like additional support. Thank you so much, Roy. The information that you shared today, it really, I know it's got me thinking. And we had a lot of really great questions too. You know, it's interesting, the quote that you had shared too from R.D. Laing about pain that comes from trying to avoid pain. And I think sometimes we kind of get stuck in that cycle too, and we don't ask for help, and we don't get the support that we need for a variety of different reasons. So I figured it might be a good opportunity to share the info line number there, the toll-free number across the province. So once again, we thank you so much, Roy, for coming in today to talk about a complicated topic, but also it was very enlightening as well. So thank you for that. I'm going to, actually, I've just placed up the info line slide there. So for those of you who have any questions, or if you wanted to delve into your own unique situation, you know, in caring for a person with dementia, or if you are a person living with dementia and you wanted to talk more freely, confidentially, please give us a call on the 1-800 number 611-6345. We're also going to be putting up a poll in a few seconds there. Claire will be putting that up, so please respond to that. So this session was recorded, and it will be hosted actually on the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia YouTube channel. So you can watch it again, and you can please feel free to make sure that your friends watch the video again with Roy, and share it with your family. Please share it with your family, or use it as a teaching tool as well. And what we're going to do today is actually we're going to leave the chat lines open for a few more minutes in case those of you have questions that you haven't had the opportunity to ask. We will keep the line open. So thank you all very much for participating today, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next virtual education session. We hope you all have a very wonderful, great, safe, long weekend as well, since we have a long weekend coming up.
Bye, everybody. My pleasure.
Thank you, Roy. Take care.